Hey there, Hetty here. I figured it was about time I got back into investing time in the channel. It's been busy over here. I'm trying to line up my next professional move, but thanks for sticking around while I juggle mundane excitements. Anyway, since I was putting together some information for a friend I'd gifted some stones to, I figured I'd take the conversation to YouTube as an ease back in video with wine. And it's not going to be edited, so roll with me. For today, rather than focus on the more theoretical, analytic, stodgy, I'm sure it comes off that way from time to time, end of things, I'm really just going to share one of the ways I use stones in my practice. It's a little different, and if you're hoping for information about correspondences or crystal grids and the like, you're not going to get that here, or in all likelihood on this channel, because that's just not a thing I do or study. So consider this a purely inspirational methods / peek into my practice video, and grab yourself a glass of wine too, if that's a thing you do. So here are my oh so creatively named working stones. They're hawk's eye and agate, but no real consideration went into which stones to buy when I decided to pick them up. I went by feel and instinct, which is the only way I ever really engage with stones and crystals. As for the number I selected, again, it was just feeling, because I didn't really have a solid idea of how I would be using them. Ultimately, I could have gone any which way. All stones the same, all different, 9 stones, 7. The way I used them evolved from the tools as I selected them, and would have done so regardless of what I had ended up choosing. I'm sure the details would have changed, but they'd have turned out no less useful, I suspect. Which is not an uncommon bit of wisdom, but it probably bears repeating. Any tool that draws me to it tends to reveal its own capacities and uses over time, so I find that there's no real need to sweat the process of choosing what to work with when I don't have a specific goal in mind to begin with. And I suspect this probably applies to most people, so let inspiration be your guide and all that. Anyway, these are the stones I ended up with. The only real permanent qualities I ever assigned to the stones themselves were the qualities of housing primarily negative, dark stones, or positive, light stones, energies. Beyond these, which have provided a sort of rough rule set for their use from the beginning, and which dictate how and when I interact with them outside of ritual settings, the specific energies and capacities I ascribe to each stone while in circle are determined in the moment. So more on that later. In between workings, I tend to carry them around with me. I keep them in separate pockets of the same little clutch that I transport my tarot cards in. Don't judge me. This was a high school graduation gift from my mom, and it still looks this damn good because I'm never going to use a fucking red clutch. Hence why it became the bag for my tarot and these stones. Anyway. I just toss the whole thing into my purse or more frequently backpack in the morning. I like to have them on hand because in cases where I'm in a bad mood or elated, I can pour some of the energy into either the hawk's eye or the agate, respectively. Now, some of you may be wondering why I would care to stockpile what I describe as negative energy. That's a big question. The short answer is that I think it's incredibly useful, potent, and its manipulation and use is wholly in my witchy wheelhouse. If it's not for you, but you want to experiment with some of the stuff that I talk about here, no sweat. Adapt what you want, toss the rest as usual. So next up, those of you who've watched any of my custom tarot deck videos will probably recognize this and be familiar with my deep and abiding love for the humble chalk marker. Truly, anything that offers the capacity to write on objects and then erase that writing with ease is, in my opinion, the tits. Just as with the cards, a chalk marker makes a delightful companion for stones. I'll note that although you can use a Sharpie on many stones and simply remove the ink with a bit of rubbing alcohol, do make sure it's not a porous stone, because that won't work very well. On the plus side, Sharpie won't smudge off on your fingers, so it's preferable if you're going to be handling the stones a lot while there's stuff written on them. To the friend for whom I prepared a set of stones. Yours are written in Sharpie because I wanted you to be able to reach for them and use them while out and about without having to worry about your pantsuit looking like you got into a slap fight with a battalion of kindergartners. However, should you wish to use them in the context of the spellcraft I'm about to describe in a few minutes, you can always use chalk marker in addition to either modify the symbols or write atop them. Now, before I get to the good part, I need to introduce one last accessory, a plate of sand. And in order to explain why a plate of sand, I should fill you in on another detail of my practice, namely that a year ago or so, I started working a lot with labyrinth symbology. I don't mean the witch's labyrinth, though, that sort of collapsing spiral. Instead, it was the labyrinth of Minos at Crete that began featuring in my practice, and which serves as the foundation of the craft I use the stones for primarily. For those unfamiliar with the myth, the very brief version is the labyrinth was a maze built to contain the Minotaur, literally the bull of Minos, and from which it could not escape. Human sacrifices and the king's enemies would be sent into the maze, and they would eventually perish, devoured by the Minotaur. Explaining how I came to work with the maze itself would take a fair bit of time, but I'll give you the abridged background because I think it helps illustrate how I perceive the labyrinth and why that is the symbology that I use. I am, and have been for a long time, a fan of what I think of as the upstart gods. Those deities who didn't know their place, or wouldn't be placed, or whose true power was only ever hinted at, and whose reputations were, one gets the impression, tarnished through eons-long PR campaigns paid for by the other god. In the case of male deities specifically, a subset of these upstarts seem to share certain commonalities, among them identification with a star, technically with a planet, Venus, whose course causes it to both lead and trail the sun, earning it the names of evening star in the evening and morning star, depending on its position. I imagine those of you raised on the Bible or who still pay for Fox are familiar with the name Morning Star. But they weren't the first to hit on this concept that a star that rises in advance of and along the same path as the sun, only to be outpaced and outshone by the brighter light, was a perfect representation of the idea of a coup or a failed primacy challenge. Similar tales can be found elsewhere. For example, in the Aztec creation myth, in which the Nahuatl, oh my god, I'm so sorry for the pronunciation, the newly transformed sun, is confronted by Quetzalcoatl, again, I'm so sorry, when he refuses to move across the sky. So you have this juxtaposition of what is going to be a high god, the sun, by this sort of challenger who isn't going to achieve the same heights and who will be cast out. And the theme of a high ruler casting down or otherwise imprisoning a star-associated threat is mirrored in the myth of the Minotaur, a demigod whose original name was Asterion. Some ancient coins from Crete, dating as early as 500 BC, seem to reference this Minotaur's astral association directly, being imprinted with a labyrinth containing a single star at its center. Anyway, this kind of upstart trying to defy the status quo imagery and the trapped imagery of the labyrinth really speaks to me, and I ended up incorporating the labyrinth directly into my practice, specifically when I was trying to work through a problem or issue that had no clear starting point, or which I felt opposed by. Clearly, it's time for another sip of wine. The basic design I came to use is a 3-tiered maze, each of whose tiers are blocked by one or more barriers. Originally, I'd draw these labyrinths out new every time on the altar, but ultimately I hit on the far more convenient and easy to transport from place to place sand in a dish. In working through a problem then, Whether it's shadow work, how best to overcome stagnation, or how to tackle a spell from an entirely new angle, I'll prepare the labyrinth with black stone barriers where the exits are supposed to be, and mentally place myself in the middle of the labyrinth. Using visualization and path working, I'll explore the environment, the blockages, and at each one, use mental craft to work out what those blockages may be, how I might disrupt or overcome them, and what to call on or do to achieve that. Over the course of the working, as I figure out what is keeping me from reaching the next tier or stage of the process, I draw out a symbol to represent that on the blocking stone. Then, when I know what I want to invoke or evoke to break through it, I'll direct that into another stone and place it atop the blocker, as if creating a bridge past the obstruction. Going back and forth between exploring barriers in a mental environment and then using material tools to cement and represent progress in the material, the whole process develops a gratifyingly balanced feel that really resonates for me. The process of going under and resurfacing in the material realm in order to interact with a model of my mental environment just introduces a physicality to the working that makes it feel like it's playing out on multiple levels, inside and outside, above and below. And if at any time I'm worn out or want to stop and return to the process later, the labyrinth and the work I've done in it can be set aside until I'm ready to dive back in. At the next session, I just review the blocks and solutions, then mentally place myself in the middle of the maze and take a stroll to where I left off. The task, spell, or working is done when I've made my way out of the labyrinth. Like any good path-working style mental work, what differentiates a genuine working from daydreaming is, in my opinion, an absence of conscious control on the environment, which in this case means the labyrinth and the blockages represented by the stones. And in the case of the labyrinth, aside from lack of conscious control, I also want to be experiencing pushback from the barriers, because it's not a barrier if I can mosey on right through it. It's not a solid representation of an internal struggle or unanswered question if the barrier doesn't elicit any sense that it really is a block standing in my way. The labyrinth itself isn't just a room, it's a cell. Getting out shouldn't just be about knocking politely on the walls and waiting to be released. Notably, because the stones are always with me when not otherwise in use, and because I handle them and dump energy into them semi-regularly, I find that when using them in this labyrinth working, the barriers induce a really potent sense of challenge. Conversely, the agates feel like they bolster whatever mini workings, emotional release, whatever, that I end up using to dispel or bypass those barriers. And since I'm personally of the school that believes that great spellcraft is defined first by the quality of the casting experience itself, which in turn predicts results, anything that adds a greater sense of foreboding, strength, oomph, or any other sensation you care to name, adds power. Barriers, particularly barriers to information you're not entirely sure you're ready for, should be forbidding, intimidating, evoke a twinge as you face it in the mental. You should be able to feel the energy coming off them in waves, and your decision to face them down and bust through them, along with whatever you call upon in or from within to do so, should evoke a sense of championship, of personal power. Because the act isn't imaginary, it's in earnest, and it should feel that way. For me, when used well, the stones in the labyrinth provide just that, and have proven a really excellent addition to my spellcrafting arsenal. So if you haven't given something like this a whirl, I do recommend it. And that's it. Happy crafting.